the last time.
Okay.
So I think people were, let's see. Recording. Sorry, guys. I forgot to do this the last time. So Kevin will speak first, and Peter will speak next.
Terrific. Thanks, Sue. And it's good to be with some of you again, and I assume some of you for the first time. As Sue indicated, we spent time in our last webinar really focusing on the external environment. We did a bit of a deep dive into some of the issues around intersectoral engagement and strategies for hospitals around broad spectrum, engaging in broad spectrum of community stakeholders. As Sue indicated, we're going to focus this time on what some might articulate as even the more significant challenge of how do we build capacity, engagement, and leadership within our organizations to do this work well. I'm just delighted to be doing this series with Sue and with Peter in particular. As Sue indicated, he'll share his personal experience. Well, that personal experience is really an on-the-ground, I think, very compelling experience that he'll share from work that he's engaged in, particularly in the city of Dallas, where there is really a rich palette, if you will, of activities and strategies and innovations in play. And each of these organizations, particularly the health systems engaged, are struggling with themselves at both how to begin to move their thinking and their actions upstream, and how to begin to think about how they might actually work together in a history where they've spent most of their time beating each other on the head and shoulders. So with that, again, I'll just reemphasize Sue's point. Our core objective in this series is to engage you in dialogue. If you have a question at any point in this presentation, please feel free to stop me, to raise your hand. Is there a particular protocol that you want?
No, they just, when they, because you see the little boxes. So when their faces will usually show up, or their phone.
Okay. So if I miss it, just.
I will be like, hey.
Okay. So I'm gonna go through these. I'm gonna open up the first few slides that we shared initially, just to re-ground ourselves into thinking about this work. And again, particularly since our focus this webinar is on building internal capacity, this is relevant. As we look at the vertical axis again, this is looking at the different kinds of payment models where we are now, moving gradually from expanding number of readmission penalties for different kinds of procedures and bundles to the assumption of what we're now calling upside risk, and gradually assuming greater risk, ultimately moving to full risk, some form of full risk capitation, global budgeting. And clearly in that context, it will be very much in the interest of hospitals to be working with the full spectrum of stakeholders. Because their hospitals will turn from revenue centers to cost centers. And we'll have to think about how do we keep people healthy and out of our institutions. On the horizontal axis is really just to capture the fact that while our hospitals have collected a lot of data over the years, there hasn't been a lot of the kind of analysis that's needed to help us think about how we move from episodic patient care to ultimately how do we improve the health of the community in the truly geographic context. You're looking at the upper right quadrant that really yields a very different kind of organizations. We might call health system has a new frame, in essence. How do they produce health? We're still a ways away from that, but that is the direction that we're looking at. And again, as I shared the last time, when we talk about how do we address health inequities, we're talking about addressing things that for the most part are outside of what we've traditionally looked at as in the realm of what we do in healthcare. Again, this is the motto is how we move from what we have talked about in healthcare as population health is really what I would call population management or population health management. It's working with a panel of patients. And when we do that, we often go down a path that ultimately leads our providers to express frustration at why is Mary not doing what I asked her to do? When we begin to move to more place-based orientation in population health, it obviously challenges us to do the analysis, to engage both more cross-disciplinary teams and community stakeholders as a way to really help more effectively address those drivers of poor health. So all of that is to lead us to how do we move from what we're doing in most of our hospitals and health systems around the country, which are relatively small-scale, innovative projects, to how do we institutionalize this work? How do we codify it? How do we scale it in our organizations and move beyond nice little one-off projects? So part of this is thinking about and many organizations talk about the fact that we have an organizational culture that drives us. This is clearly in our Catholic, our Adventist, a number of our other faith-based institutions would say we have a culture that drives us to focus on how we serve the poor, how do we address this. Many others may or may not be faith-based, but our safety net hospitals, and there are a variety of other factors that may contribute to this culture as we talk about it. It is often operationalized through the work that we do that is articulated as community benefit, but at least in the last few decades, one I think would legitimately argue that it's not particularly embedded in our core business decisions. That we tend to separate out our markets from the work that we do that we think is consistent with that organizational culture. But that is ultimately where we want to move. As we think about this work, it's important to really look at what we're talking about when we reference the concept of institutional policies. And that's really how do we formalize the functions that we might point to as, we may have a chief strategy officer, or we may have a public affairs officer who really gets communities, who does really good work, but it's not in either their job descriptions. There's no accountabilities that they may have related to how do we move in this direction. And when, those individuals move on to other avenues, that those practices and the functions associated with those practices are lost. So importance here is how do we think more systematically? Do we have committees at the governance level that have a focus on this? Do they have a clear charter for their spectrum of responsibilities? Do they have the competencies that they need? Do we have people in positions that have a clear focus on population health? Do we have competencies in those job descriptions and responsibilities that articulate that? Are we looking at how do we integrate across our organization? For example, we've tended to look at community benefit as nice things we do on the side and fulfilling our compliance expectations, but not really looking at how that can be integrated with and actually serve as an engine to drive our population health capacity building. But that's what we're talking about in that arena. So just looking at this issue of how do we integrate this work and a little more deeply. We have an array of ways in which we can look at this. In fact, in California, our Office of Statewide Health Planning and Development collects all the utilization data from all the hospitals, and it is available, and they can actually conduct targeted analyses for folks. such as doing an analysis of prevention quality indicators, and they can break it out by payer source and facilities at the zip code level. That would enable us to look pretty quickly at and identify where we have geographic concentrations of people who are coming into our emergency rooms for conditions that could have been prevented. But we need to ask and need to look at the degree to which we have the internal capacity to do these kinds of analysis. And if we don't have that, what steps need to be taken to build that? Do we have GIS capacity? Are we able to actually look at where these are located? Are we adding social determinants of health indicators? Many hospitals and health systems are beginning to, for example, integrate a couple of the standard questions around food insecurity into their electronic health records, looking at ways in which to have the overlay of demographics, make sure that we're getting that race and ethnicity, as well as household income. And then beginning to move to how do we begin to share data with others. In most cases, somewhat sadly, our FQHCs and hospitals' primary way of sharing data and information these days is still the fax machine, which is pretty sad given the level of technology that we have available. But those are particular areas of focus.
Catherine raised her hand.
Yes.
I did. This is an amazing slide with like a ton of information, and you're asking a lot of really great questions. And I'm just wondering, if you take a whiteboard and map out all of this, it's a big project. And I'm wondering, my background is working with Kaiser, and we've got a pretty extensive population management program within the organization. And I just wonder if you looked at models that were working and the components of the models that were working and kind of back out of it instead of whiteboarding it from scratch. Is there a way that you can look at maybe some models that are working and kind of, retro design?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. We do have actually a self-assessment tool. I'm doing a webinar tomorrow for America's Essential Hospitals that uses a self-assessment tool we developed for a project that we're doing for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. It's called Alignment of Governance and Leadership in Healthcare. We have a self-assessment tool where teams of board members and senior leaders that participate in this process identify where they are in each of these areas, in data systems development and financial innovations, in care redesign models, et cetera. And we are beginning to identify, in essence, to put together the whiteboard that you're talking about. And I have a couple slides a little further along that look at and help to sort of lay out in a more linear way what might be some steps in this process. We are in a situation as it relates to that initiative where we would have to get permission from many of these organizations to share their models. And the truth be told is that as we have dug into this more deeply, we find that we're actually a lot less far along than we thought we were. I would note even colleagues I've spoken with at Kaiser say, yeah, we're not as far along as you think we are. I mean, they are among the leaders in this arena. And if I were to draw a real life progression, they would probably be one of the more immediate that we would look at. There are a few others across the country. I think it's a great idea, great suggestion, and something that we are looking at ways in which we can lay out going forward. But again, the truth be told, we're still pretty darn early on in the process.
Got it. Okay.
Please go ahead.
She was just saying.
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. I thought you were starting to say something else. So just to touch on the second half of this slide is how do we then begin to think of where those synergistic opportunities lie. If we are focusing, we do have an ACO, we're focusing on dual diagnosis patients, then it's likely, here's another example. We're focusing on asthma patients, and we're focusing on those that are frequent users of our emergency room. What we likely will find is there'll be some concentration of those asthma patients that use our EDs frequently, who live in absentee landlord housing with cockroaches, dust mites, dirty old carpets, and the like. And it begins to open our thinking. Those that have done this work pretty quickly look at the fact that there are other factors outside of whether or not they are making sure somebody can get bed covers and they have their spacer and they have all of their medications, but they still are coming into the emergency room. It leads us to say, well, gosh, are there ways in which we can direct our community benefit resources in these very same neighborhoods to help impact this issue? So that's just one example of beginning to think about that. Another here on that list, and I mentioned the concept of triple lane. Many of our hospitals, and they look at triple lane population health, again, their tendency has been to focus on their panels of patients. And it's really important to begin to challenge ourselves to go beyond that and to think across different kinds of groups. And then is looking at ways in which you establish incentives across departments. So increasing number of hospitals and health systems that are establishing at-risk compensation for leaders, and doing that as it relates to population and community health objectives is an important step in that right direction. And if you create incentives that challenge departments that may have their hands on data that other departments could use, then you begin to help move that agenda. So here's an example of more of the kind of whiteboard that Catherine referenced. So thinking through, down the left side of this chart, you'll see there a list of potential institutional policies, and then across the board are actions that one can take along the way. So if you have electronic medical records or health records, often starts at doing pilot sites and then a mandated rollout and formalizing accountabilities around that, and gradually moving to the initial pilot to integrating social determinants of health and then ultimately rollout. So beginning to think more systematically, how do we move along that path? Same as it relates to having senior leadership responsibilities, hiring new staff, establishing metrics, including at-risk compensation metrics, moving from panel analysis to GIS coding, then integrating mobile technology.
She has another question.
Yes, Catherine.
Oh, I don't mean to interrupt, but you can.
Oh, no, please. I want you to.
You know, part of my history is also the interoperability with health information exchanges, and this seems very similar in the concept. You know, part of the challenge there was finding a platform that everyone could rally around to plug in their various systems, right? And I'm just wondering if that work is been done in this space. Are they likely to be the same platforms? You know, that whole sort of vetting of the platform could be done in parallel to the governance structures that you're talking about here.
Yes. Yeah, and I think what you point up and what I have learned in my own initial ignorance on this issue, I didn't realize that most of the models for health information exchanges focused on queries that a physician conducts for, you know, Mr. Rodriguez. They're not geared for actually looking at a population and doing a search for a larger population. Folks that want to do that have had to do that manually. they're
Can
beginning. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, just one reason why that was true was really because of data storage. So everybody wanted to maintain their own data.
Yeah.
And the only way that anybody would feel comfortable is if they just allow queries into their own data source,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
So to get the kind of aggregated data that you're talking about in this model, you'd need an additional level of agreement from the people to actually aggregate. And because in the HIE model, they weren't actually forming a legitimate organization, right? It was more like a loose collaborative. That agreement didn't really stand. And so I don't know what your legal structure is here, but you might actually be able to overcome that problem if you get people to agree on that second level of agreement.
Yeah. Catherine, are you aware of any examples where they have achieved that?
Yeah, I think, it's been several years since I've been in that space, but I certainly know where I can ask. I used to run a couple, and one is in Orange County, and I think that there were components of that where they were agreeing on aggregation. So I can certainly look.
Can I just add, so Martin Love and I think Jessica, I'm not sure, from Humboldt, so they actually run an HIE. I don't know, Martin, Jessica, if you have anything you want to share on that piece before we move on.
Just briefly, we do some aggregation from the HIE, and we use the data from the HIE within another project. That said, there are still a number of barriers, and we're not providing community-wide data except with respect to HEDIS measures. Though we have started some initiatives to look into that.
That's great. Great to know. We'll want to keep up on your progress with that.
Thank you.
Thank you. So another form of integration and internal alignment has to do specifically with our thinking around community benefit and community. What increasingly hospitals are jettisoning the term community benefit and focusing on community health. To their credit, I think it reflects a commitment to say, let's get out of the compliance box and really look at community health as a core strategy for us as an organization going forward. So that reflects that. But looking at that portfolio, doing a better job of assessing assets, mapping utilization data and linking that to that, and then looking at ways in which we can leverage our resources through engagement of community stakeholders and competitors. Increasingly, there's the recognition that we're not competing per se for the underinsured and uninsured populations, right? And we're also recognizing that if we're going to have an impact upon the social determinants for populations such as our Medicaid populations, we're going to have to look at increasing the dose, that is more targeted investments of multiple stakeholders to have that impact. And that involves really being more thoughtful about, do we have a charter, do we have an oversight structure, do we have clear criteria for our community benefit resource allocations, do we have accountabilities at the senior leadership level, do we have the boots on the ground to do the work? If we just have people whose job is to compile disconnected projects, then we're probably not going to do quality work in our communities. And last but certainly not least, at the bottom of this is increasingly beginning to look at what's our investment portfolio as an organization, and is there a percentage of that we can designate for investments? Again, these are not grants; these are loans in areas such as affordable housing, childcare centers, healthy food financing, and the like, that will help move that agenda forward. And how do we integrate that overall into our oversight structures? I think I'm I'm close to the end, but I wanted to, this slide is an attempt to capture both the internal integration we've been talking about today, and then its internal and external alignment to what we spoke about the other day, as a way of beginning to think more strategically as organizations to how to move this. The immediate column on the right identifies some short-term ways in which we can validate this work with leadership, and then the far right beginning to move to what we might call harder metrics that demonstrate. And they get at issues of return on investment, but also larger social return on investment. How do we begin to validate investments that yield benefits for the community and a variety of other stakeholders, including reducing the need for public expenditures, and how do we codify that? How do we deal with the savings associated?
So Kevin, can I just, on the piece that you just spoke up last week when we had our convening in Pasadena, I think this aha around return on investment that is other than financial, there was some discussion about that, and what are the metrics kind of around that piece. So just to kind of point that out.
Great. Great.
It's an important one, because I think we're always so focused on finance that there are other things.
I agree, and it is important also as we think about the establishment of intermediary structures to support meaningful engagement. You know, the FSG term, as we touched on last time, was collective impact. The Federal Reserve calls it a community quarterback. Whatever we call it is an entity that we co-invest in with others, that has the charge to facilitate, to monitor, to support, and we have to make sure that we're investing savings from efforts to reinforce that kind of structure going forward.
That's what they're all about, those ACHs.
Yes, you're right. That's right. That's another term for it.
Yeah.
So these slides I want to go through quickly, and again, recognize that many of you on the call may not interface with your boards, but these are tools, and these slides are welcome to use as ways in which to engage your own leadership. I suspect many, if not most of you, are the champions within your own organizations to look at how to move these issues forward. So look at these slides with this in mind, and just know when we can provide a variety of more specific examples of work across the country that documents this, that could help you bring this to your own colleagues in the leadership. Our legacy board dynamics, when we look back at how we function, it's always been bankers and accountants and lawyers that we look to, maybe somebody who's got a lot of money that can help with fundraising. And really, as hospitals and health systems had been disinclined to engage these boards because of their composition on these issues around how do we fulfill our charitable obligations. But now that we're moving to a different model of financing, our world has suddenly exploded into a much larger realm of operations and accountabilities and expectations. And that really challenges us to think more broadly about who do we bring on these boards and in what ways do we engage them. Historically, they sort of would just approve formal proposals that are brought to them. Increasingly, boards are being engaged more in the realm of what we would call think tanks, where they are expected, in fact, to provide input and to help shape strategies that are brought to them by senior leaders. So a lot of these, almost all of the kinds of issues we're talking about are strategic now. And it's important that we have people on the board who are in a position to ask the right kinds of questions at the right times. Even if we just look at quality care, most boards now have a quality committee, but now this issue of quality, it has taken us outside of the traditional sites for services, more diverse teams, and a lot of issues where the actual quality is outside of what we have typically have responsibility for. And these are the kinds of competencies that we're looking at and are good questions to ask. Do we have people on our board that have the kind of exposure and experience that help us as an organization that's now concerned with things outside of our four walls? How do we engage?
Question.
You have a question?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, it's me again.
Yeah.
So
We really
again,
do
just
appreciate you
I
raising.
know. Good.
Yeah, thank
Yes.
So again, just amazing the parallels to my health information exchange time. But in that period, there was a lot of mandates that were requirements that the hospitals needed to meet in order to participate. And this is a relatively new. The public health realm is and the ACH is new to me. Is there an obligation or some sort of mandate that is driving participation and therefore financial contribution, or is this all just about doing the right thing?
You mean in terms of board composition?
Board composition, and I mean really the financial model of really contributing. I mean, investments have to be made to the ACH membership, right?
Yeah.
Or by the ACH
Yeah.
membership. So what is driving that requirement?
Great question. And there are no mandates that are driving that, that's for sure. I would say this is being driven by the growing awareness among leaders that they are going to have to engage, and that they need board members who can support the kinds of bold steps that need to be taken. And so if you have a board that sees its charge much more narrowly in traditional fiduciary terms and yielding margins, but you're recognizing you need to step out into areas where your organizational skills may be stretched, you're taking more risk, and that risk has financial implications. You're going to be less likely to do that if you don't have board members who are willing to take those risks with you. So that's part of the internal motivation.
Yeah, and really have the authority to do it, right? I mean, they have to have the authority to speak on behalf of the organizations they represent.
Absolutely. I have more than one colleague who was formerly a hospital or health system CEO that ended up leaving those systems because they were impatient with their inability to take the steps that they recognized had to be taken, and couldn't get their boards behind them. So it's just an important discussion.
Yeah, the challenge there, at least in the HIE conversations, was really around the data being seen as capital, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you ask organizations to share their data on their patients, that is actually asking them, to share their secret sauce. And people were reticent to it. And the only way in which they actually contributed was around the safety net population, because everybody recognized we all lose money on that population. So I'll share data for that population.
Right.
And so from a strategy perspective, when you're thinking about pursuing particular projects, you might look at the low hanging fruit to see what is the least scary place that we can get people to invest and commit. And that's certainly where we found traction in those conversations. And it might be the same here.
Couldn't agree more. So this is just a way of thinking, and a more linear way about how do we move from where we are to where we want to go as it relates to our board. So it often starts with some initial education on population health and social determinants. There are we have a standard strategy for assessing existing competencies, recruiting to fill those gaps, forming explicit committees such as a population health committee of the board, setting metrics, reviewing and setting protocols for how we move forward, and then beginning to adopt, to implement on a system-wide basis. I got a repeat there. So the last is, these are just a set of questions that, that we believe are important questions for a board that is beginning to assume more of that think tank orientation. I serve on the board of the Trinity Health System, and we have an 80-20 rule of the board. Anybody that comes before the board, including senior leaders, know that 80% of our time is for conversation and 20% for presentation. So we're just supposed to we are expected to read our 800-page board book before we arrive, and that they're going to go right to some core questions that we want to ask. And the benefit of that is we have time to really dig into, well, this strategy looks great, but have you thought about this and have you thought about that? And these are really important kinds of questions to ask. So, and then just a highlight of some of the drivers that can be impediments and or enhancements to the efforts to move in this direction. Now, I'll just leave that with you and turn it over to Peter.
Great. So actually, Peter, yeah, the slot, I don't know if you want to actually, we could control the slides, or you want to just control them?
Yeah, you can go ahead and control. We'll just stay here for a minute and then I'll let you know.
Okay.
Okay.
Great.
So thank you very much. If we could, Sue, if we could go back to the cover slide.
Okay.
For just a second.
Sure.
This, I want to share with everybody that this was the hardest part of my challenge in Dallas. My organization, as some of you know, was a children's hospital, still is a children's hospital, and it hired me to build a population health program in Dallas. I can tell you, as Kevin alluded to, that building programs was easy in my mind compared to embedding community health into the organization's DNA. This is absolutely the hardest thing. And I will be very honest, as those of you who know me, I was last time, I also feel it was the least I was the least successful in this part of my job. I regretted that. So some of you may be experiencing some of the same frustrations that I did. Although I was in a hospital, you may be in other organizations. I encountered organizational leaders who would support the concept of community health when in conversation with me. But then when they were sitting on very key and core committees in their organization, would not necessarily raise their hands to support the allocation of resources to community health or the continuation of programs. And I found, and I'm sure some of you as well can find, that this can be a very lonely endeavor and it can be pretty frustrating. So my challenge then was, okay, how do I build an internal support system that is going to outlast me? So if we could move to the next slide. A key aha for me was the first bullet. Authority is absolutely necessary, and I was hired by the CEO and the board and was given the challenge and given the mantle of authority, but it's not sufficient. And it is the support from the rest of the organization that will make or break the sustainability of your programs. And organizational support is important both in terms of the concepts and the metrics, but also people's hearts. And I found that I had to actually work simultaneously in both areas, and I'll show you how. Executive leadership support, how do I get executive leaders to help work with me to co-create those community goals, strategies, and metrics. If they're all just mine or all just coming from my department, then it's easy to dismiss them. Committee leadership. How do I get some of the executive leaders to serve on some key community committees? There's nothing like getting an executive leader into the community, sitting on a community, interacting. It is absolutely, whether it's a task force, a committee, or a board, but it does create that public face and that public commitment from the organization. And again, that's whether it's a hospital or any other organization. In regular reporting, Kevin talked a lot about the importance of the formal metrics. And then he complemented that by saying, don't forget the anecdotes, don't forget the storytelling. That is equally as important. And then the most important vehicle that I used for getting executive and you'll see middle management support was to get them involved in what some people would call design studios. So when you gather a group of residents from a neighborhood or the community around a table with community agency participation and your own organization's participation, there's nothing more powerful to move an individual executive leader or middle management leader than sitting next to and really listening and hearing from the community residents themselves and challenging each other about how to approach some of those neighborhood challenges. Next slide, Sue. And the same would go for middle management. In this particular category, volunteerism can be extremely valuable. And what I found was I would make it personal. I would invite selected people to actually join me in volunteer activities. And that was able to engage them from their passion and their heart. But then equally important is the committee participation in design studios. What I found in the hospital was that the clinical staff were my strongest allies and that they brought a clinical perspective into the work that I didn't have. And when they participated in design studios, they became zealots and would go back to their particular clinical arena and really send the message on my behalf. We can go to the next slide, Sue. Kevin talked a lot about creating policies and structures. And I never appreciated how important this was, and Kevin helped me with this. How is community health reflected in your organization's mission, vision, or strategic plan? And if it's not, how can you move it into being very visible? Again, it's not about you as a leader, it's about the organization. And what seeds can you plant now that will bear fruit years after you may move on from that organization? Do we have a question?
Yeah, it looks like we have a question from Catherine.
Yes, Catherine.
I'm really struck by your intro, and I can feel your pain on how difficult it must be to kind of integrate that in, and you're laying out some things about incentives for employees. Again, at Kaiser, there was a direct result from the physicians if they were low on their scores, right? So if you think about having population health management scores, if someone fell below their cancer scores, there were implications. So they would be put on a list, they would have to have interventions. And obviously that's the benefit of being an internal system like that. But I just wonder if there's something that, I almost can envision like a Yelp score for physicians that, because I guess I recognize that I'm not sure that people doing it altruistically is necessarily going to always work. So I'm just wondering what other tools there might be to bring some pressure to bear on the community benefit measures.
Well, and Catherine, can I just, I think just to kind of, this really is examples that are inside of hospitals, and if you use kind of the technique of analogous inspiration, right, the question really can be for your ACH membership, when you're looking at some of these questions and the questions that Kevin brought forward, when it gets really down to it, this is about being accountable to each other for the mission of which you're, come together, that shared intent. So I think there are really great examples, and then kind of the thinking is there's the group together, but what can they do back in their own organizations to actually spread this, right? And when it comes to incentives, allocation of resources, kind of all of those things, I think it's really an important piece. So
I see. Okay, so
yeah.
this is Thank you for that clarification.
Sure. Thank you very much, Catherine. And then we have something on the chat from Kitty Bailey about the concept of design studio. And Kitty, if you don't mind, I'll send some information to Sue from my experience that she can share in terms of an outline, purpose statement, and description of the design studio concept. I think it can be a very powerful tool to use. And so thank you for that question. Incentive compensation for employees was an area that we were able to explore at Children's Health. Being a senior leader and executive leader there, I was able to get a couple of measures into the incentive compensation program for the whole community, the whole company at all levels, and found that to be very powerful. We had a board committee on population health, and there was nothing more powerful than having the board member who chaired that committee actually report out at regular board meetings, rather than have the management suits like myself report out, to have a fellow board member report out on community health activities. Even if you don't have a board committee, you might want to consider how fellow board members can actually report out to each other on what's going on. And then the organizational scorecard you see there, that was critically important. And as I was a senior leader, I was able to actually insert a few community health measures into the organizational scorecard, because it just forces it to become much more of a priority for the organization, whether it's a hospital or any of your others. We can go to the next one for next slide. Metrics and reporting. Kevin talked about the metrics and reporting. It would be the previous slides, Sue.
Let's see.
So.
Okay. Oh, okay. For some reason, it's not.
Okay, no problem. I can just
it's not there.
I can just talk through it
okay.
verbally. The importance in metrics and reporting is to create line of sight with the existing organizational dashboard. So rather than just creating your own, which is very important, you've got to create those explicit linkages with the organization's dashboard metrics, even if they're just short-term or leading indicators. How is community health directly and concrete immediately making a difference. The second is regular reporting across the organization. I can't tell you how many road shows I did across the organizations for all kinds of groups on all shifts, morning, noon, and night, whether it was storytelling, anecdotes and testimonials, or concrete metrics. I used all the tricks I could, and I used everything I could to try and keep community health in front of that organization. And then the final one, which I think is really important, is how to use an organization's internal and external media. I tried to get stories placed constantly. I would enter award contests for nothing more than the opportunity to get more visibility for the work that was being done. I wrote white papers, and I would share them internally in the organization as well as in the community. Trying to keep community health visible and public was a critical part of the work I did. And as I explained in the beginning and shared quite honestly, I think I was less successful in embedding community health into the organization's DNA than I was in actually starting and launching new programs. So I would encourage all of you to take this very seriously, as Kevin has laid out, and really try and create your own roadmap in your own organizations. And some of you have to do this in multiple organizations. I can understand that and appreciate that. But laying out these roadmaps is really important. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter. Wow. Kevin, do you have any thoughts or responses? Or
No, I was just I thank you, Peter, for driving home these issues in a real and practical way. I did note, Kitty, I think you noted that you had in San Diego that you were launching your
the HIE.
EIH, and I think you're talking about Health Connect. Do I have that right?
I'm not sure if she's still on.
She might not be with
Yeah.
us. I
But
think
I
at
think
least
so, yeah.
my knowledge
Dan,
of that
she
is
is,
it's
yeah.
still limited to it's a query system.
Yeah.
I'd love to see them move further, but
Yeah. I know we're just about out of time, but I'm just wondering, for those of you that are on, I see Shelley and Larry. Shelley, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or responses to what you've heard.
That was really a great presentation. I'm sorry I missed the first part of it. We're under crazy fire stuff here in Lake County.
Yeah.
So I like, can I join? I think I can. I had a window. So I'm sure you said this at the beginning, but will you be sharing this?
Yes.
PowerPoint?
Yeah. Okay. And I think I recorded it, so hopefully.
I see that it's recording.
Oh,
so
good.
I would be really interested. Just really good nuggets there. I wish that I had been able to be a little bit more present for the whole thing. I would love to see some samples of the dashboards. That I put that on the chat just now. I'm right in the middle of trying to do that within my own organization, and I'm not nailing it. So I would love to see, I'm sorry, the last gentleman, Peter, was it?
Yes. Oh, yes.
I would love to see, even if data was removed, just to get a visual of what you would regularly show at executive council or a clinic staff meeting. I haven't quite figured that out, and I haven't seen anything that I thought really made sense. I'm really glad because I'm being asked to present my metrics right alongside all the metrics of the hospital, inpatient, and clinics, as though they're just as important. So I think that's a really good win, but I don't feel like I've nailed it. So those are my two, just PowerPoints, and then if there was any samples of that. And then that design studio, I was the one that asked that question. I love the phrase design studio instead of committee. So that just sounds way more effective. So I'd love to see any kind of outline of what that gathering would look like, or agendas or whatever.
Great. And I think, Peter, because we've talked about this, kind of the notion of design thinking, Shelley, and there are a fair amount of the tools in the playbook that are pretty much like that. But you know, and I think it's really coming together around shared intent, and you know, kind of going through some pretty rapid fire processes, right, where you use that. But I don't know, just in closing, Peter, anything to add, you know, related to that? Or?
No,
Okay.
we'll all three of us, between probably Kevin, Sue, and myself, put together some dashboard information for you, and whatever we've got on design thinking and design studios. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I would just add, I think in the spirit of one of our phases, that you don't have to wait till that, of prototyping. I mean, to begin to think about having a dialogue, like what's important to us, and including the community, and kind of trying out some things that you could measure, you know, pretty quickly. Like, you know, sometimes some of our data takes so long. So it's kind of just really exploring. I see Larry, because I know you were really interested, I think, on the ROI from the social, the human capital, kind of those other perspectives. So kind of thinking about that also.
A lot to digest.
Yeah, I know. It is a lot. So I know we're out of time, but again, we recorded, we'll get the slides out. And actually just, I a while ago sent you the link to our webpage that we created on WordPress. And so that's where I'm going to be posting all of our information. Our first presentation that we did in August is actually hosted there. So the slides are there, and the PowerPoint and the recording. So I'll put that there. So hopefully you'll train yourselves to go there. And I'm going to try to not embed things so much in email so it won't get lost. You know, so, but thank you so much, Peter and Kevin, and thank you all for joining today.
Thank you.
And
Thank
stay
you.
safe, Shelley.
Will do.
Thanks, Peter.
Okay. Okay, let's see.